Good afternoon, class. Colonel Hamilton, Mr. Rhodes. My name is Cadet Brittany Vaichus, and I will be presenting an unclassified informal brief on the battle analysis of Tet Offensive. First, I'm going to start with an outline. We'll be covering the who, what, where, when, and why, and then we'll set the stage by covering the strategic, operational, and tactical elements of the Battle of Tet Offensive. We'll compare the opposing forces and describe the actions on the objective. Finally, we'll review the lessons learned and references, and then I will have any time for questions which you may have. Background. The WHO. North Vietnamese People's Army, South Vietnam Army of the Republic, the United States, and the Allies. What happened? Tet Offensive. North Vietnam conducts a series of coordinated offensive surprise attacks on South Vietnam and U.S. forces after declaring a ceasefire for the Vietnam holiday New Year called Tet. Now, Tet was the holiday celebrated on the New Year, or the Lunar Year, which represented the alliance between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It was celebrated every year, and during the War of Vietnam, North Vietnam declared a 7-day ceasefire. On day 2 of the ceasefire, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, guns ablazing, into 100 cities and 44 villages, breaking the truce. This happened in South Vietnam on January 30th, 1968. North Vietnam did this in order to foment rebellion among South Vietnam, as well as to deter U.S. support in South Vietnam and their involvement in the war. The key players are the President of North Vietnam, the President of South Vietnam, and then William Charles Westmoreland, who was the general in charge during Tet Offensive. Setting the stage, we're going to look at the 3 components: strategic, operational, and tactical. For the strategic, Vietnam was divided between a North communist and a South anti-communist, supported by U.S. forces. As North Vietnam was progressing into South Vietnam and aggressively seizing and gaining control of the territory, South Vietnam pushed back. U.S. aided in the fight against North Vietnam by commencing airstrikes, as well as sending 536,000 ground forces into South Vietnam to help protect and defend the land. As the U.S. forces were sent to South Vietnam, this triggered the attack of Tet Offensive by North Vietnam on January 30th, 1968. The operational, or the overall picture, is that North Vietnam conducted coordinated defense on South Vietnam U.S. forces after declaring a ceasefire for the lunar holiday. And tactically, North Vietnam utilizes the elements of surprise, concentration, audacity, tempo to launch a series of coordinated attacks on South Vietnam. Opposing forces. South Vietnam and U.S. represent a joint force of roughly 1 million personnel. North Vietnam estimated 323,000 and 595,000. Looking at those numbers, we see a 200-man gap. So we're saying, okay, where are all those people? We're not entirely sure, is the answer to the question. Our intelligence did not in any way predict this invasion from North Vietnam during the ceasefire. We were totally unprepared for it. People who look at the Tet Offensive would say, wow, North Vietnam conducted this series of coordinated attacks with our pants down. We were completely helpless and unready for this surprise attack. Looking at the technology, U.S. had roughly 100,000 tons of bombs, which is the equivalent of 5 modern-day atomic bombs. We had aircraft, missiles, chemicals, artillery, M1 carbon weapon system, claymore mines, rocket launchers, anti-tank weapons, and cruiser weapons. North Vietnam had roughly all of the same technical advances. However, they were also Soviet supplied, so they had the PT light amphibious tanks as well as the explosives such as the K-50 Mike. For logistical systems, U.S. made continuous efforts to deliver supplies to U.S. Marines despite heavy firepower and rough terrain. The Marines were isolated in many cases, such as the Battle of Quezon or on Route 9 battle. And in situations like these, the Marines were able to hold their ground by cutting rations, by making do with the ammo and supplies that they had. However, it was very harsh conditions in terms of supply and logistics, whereas North Vietnam was largely supplied by the People's Republic of China as well as the Soviet Union. Command, control, and communications. The Battle of Quezon, which was 9 days prior to the Tet Offensive, resulted in a retreat of U.S. forces. the North Vietnam communications line advanced into south. So we're seeing here that even before Tet Offensive happened, South Vietnam was already hurting, and along with U.S. forces. They were already hurting because they had been beaten back 9 days prior. The morale was very low. The conditions of the troops was very poor. In terms of communications, both sides had the use of encryption systems, radio, and telephone capabilities. However, centralized command for North Vietnam and decentralized for South Vietnam and U.S. forces, that being because U.S. forces were stateside as well as located in South Vietnam. Intelligence. North Vietnam had a weak recon and intelligence team in comparison to the U.S. forces, which had CIA, NSA, Department of State. We had so much more intelligence. However, we did expect them to hold true to their word in declaring the ceasefire, which we fell for the trap. Doctrine and training. Guerrilla militia of North Vietnam proved to be a relentless fighting force that challenged the readiness of U.S. forces and South Vietnam forces. The guerrilla warfare was absolutely relentless. They were plowing through. They would not stop. Some might even look at them and say that they were a suicidal force. U.S. forces and South Vietnam soon learned that it's hard to stop someone who doesn't give up. The condition and morale. This is given from Gregory Daddis, who represents Oxford Research. He said, contemporary policymakers clearly understood the difficulties of waging war in Southeast Asia against the enemy committed to national liberation. Yet the faith of these Americans in their power to resolve the deep-seated local and regional socio-political problems eclipsed the possibility that there might be limits to that power. That power references to North Vietnam, saying that although U.S. policymakers understood the condition of the communism and the deep-seated political issues, the American soldier, in alliance with South Vietnam, realized that there's a possibility that, and a hope that we would be able to stand our ground and we would be able to remain an anti-communist territory. Looking at the leadership, we see that the U.S. senior political leaders, the public press, the People's Armies of Vietnam, and General William Childs Westmoreland all played key roles in the Battle of Tet Offensive. I want to touch specifically on the public press and how that influenced the soldier. The public press did not support the war in Vietnam, which had huge implications on the morale of U.S. forces. Soldiers who returned from the Vietnam War were often greeted with unwelcome, if not hostile, conditions. They were having tomatoes and lettuce thrown at them. They were not supported. And this reflected in the condition and the attitudes of the soldiers. A news reporter of the time wrote, discipline, especially in the rear base camps, had begun breaking down in many units toward the end of the war, as it became apparent that America was only interested in leaving Vietnam. A common saying of the time was that no one wanted to die. No one wanted to be the last man to die in Vietnam. This is so true in how the soldiers were viewed during the time. They thought that the only intentions of the U.S. was to pull out. They had no reason and no purpose, which is so important why we provide our soldiers with that reason why. Why are we conducting? Why are we defending? Why are we sustaining this territory? Actions on the objective. We're going to first start with the mission of the opposing forces. North Vietnam People's Army conducted a series of coordinated surprise attacks on over 100 southern Vietnam cities during the Battle of Tet Offensive in efforts to deter the anti-communist southern forces, seize and control the territory, disrupt the U.S. military presence, and support the region. Disposition of initial forces. North Vietnam tactically advanced into southern Vietnam territory by utilizing means of surprise, audacity, and tempo. Concentration of force on key initial locations on the Corps 1 and 2 of tactical zones in South Vietnam, which are located here in this lower portion in the lower region of South Vietnam. Opening moves of the battle. North Vietnam gained strategic, tactical, operational advantage in the Vietnam War when they initiated Tet Offensive. Here in the legend, you can see Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam, and his pattern, how he conducted a series of attacks starting here and then moving to the lower range of Saigon, which is where the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Corps held their troops. He was very strategic in attacking the major U.S. bases, especially the air bases, which were conducting airstrikes on his North Vietnamese army. Detail the battle's major phases. First, we have the assault on North Vietnam. We have the retaliation of U.S. forces. We have the Battle of Hue, which represented a stalemate. The reason it's a stalemate is because we lost so many U.S. forces. However, we were able to scale back some of that oppression coming from North Vietnam. North Vietnam was successful in the fact that they were able to make U.S. forces reconsider their involvement in the war and make U.S. stateside consider, the policymakers consider our involvement in the war. And lastly, we want to look at the outcome. While North Vietnam forces suffered heavy casualties from U.S. joint forces, the battle negatively influenced the support of U.S. participation in the Vietnam War. U.S. forces returned to an unwelcoming, if not hostile, environment in return for their military service. As an overview, let's take a look at the lessons learned. First, we have the power of the press to influence the military operations, and the necessity of creating public assurance in foreign policy. We see that how the public and the press really influence the condition and morale of the soldier. The limitations of military intelligence for strength, composition, disposition of enemy forces. Although our intelligence was very strong for that day and age, we were not able to predict what North Vietnam was able to do. As a leader, we need to be aware of the limitations of intelligence and how it cannot predict the future, it can only make observations. We also need to realize the importance of executive decision-making and quick reaction time. U.S. forces in alliance with South Vietnam did not have time to ponder what to do next. They had to be ready, they had to be mobile, they had to be flexible and maneuver in their plan. Otherwise, they would not have been able to combat the unexpected attacks from North Vietnam. I have my list of my references, and at this time I'll be taking any questions. Thank you. The time is now so-and-so. This concludes my brief.